Hello, my name is Spencer and I like to craft and build things to escape reality for a little bit. This video will be my submission for Boylei Hobby Time's monthly Patreon art challenge. The prompt for June is A Day at the Lake. I will reuse this little random practice diorama I made into something more appropriate for this prompt. I unfortunately don't live anywhere near a lake really, so I decided to make a miniaturized version of a local park that has a larger pond area. To start the extreme makeover, I needed to use a new layer of XPS foam for the base of the terrain. On my hot wire cutter, I cut it to length, sanding it down to make sure that it fit snugly. I broke out my handheld hot wire cutter to then make the terrain flush with the picture frame base. I then took a quick break to clean up all of the toxic XPS dust in my area. Next, I broke into the ever so handy Google Earth to get a bird's eye view of Ada Hayden Heritage Park, the largest arguable lake in my area. Ada Hayden is actually an old 61-foot deep quarry that my community bought and filled with water, so it is stocked with fish. People do paddleboard and put small fishing canoes on it, but there is no actual swimming here at all. I then took a snip of the rough area I'd like to focus on for this diorama. I then took my snip into my editing software so I could look into where the shorelines of the water areas were more accurately. I then filled in all the water areas with a black so I could tell on the paper where the fine lines should be. Once I had a stencil that I was happy with, I put it into a Word doc and measured it to the size of my foam block to print off. Once printed, I cut out my stencil and used my hobby knife to trim out all of the black areas from before. Once the stencil had been stenciled, I could tape it down on top of the foam block. I also taped down some of the areas that I was concerned that may be blown around in the next step. I busted out my airbrush to apply a black spray from directly above. Once the spray had dried, we can then remove the stencil to see the areas of the terrain that will need to be recessed for water later. To create more XPS dust, I busted out my Dremel to start digging into the terrain. I didn't mention this in the previous step, but I always use my respirator whenever I do anything related to XPS foam. Whenever you burn it or have fine particulates in the air, they can be rather toxic for your lungs. So whenever you use it anything for more than a box cutter or a hobby knife, I make sure to mask up. Speaking of a knife, I made sure to make a little straight to connect the two larger bodies of water. I then took a butane torch to smooth out the terrain to make it look a little bit less like cut up foam. Using my foam cut from earlier, I marked out where I can add a small layer to this diorama. With some first-hand experience, I know that the northwest corner of this park has a slightly higher elevation than the rest of the park, which creates something similar to a scenic overlook effect. I cut out the slope with my hot wire cutter and then glued it into place. I smoothed out the slope again to make it seem a little bit more like a nice gentle hill instead of a small cliff. I cleaned up a bit more with some more fine grit sandpaper to really smoothen it out. I mixed up a fairly liquidy terrain paste made out of plaster and water to put all over the base of the diorama. Using my gloved hand and some isopropyl alcohol, I then went in to smooth out the clumps of paste. I then liberally applied some glue to the whole of the base of the water areas, putting in increasingly smaller versions of rocks and ballast into the basins. I got out some armature wire and trimmed it into small stubs to serve as some tree trunks. I then glued our metal wooden trunks into place. I wanted to use a liquid mask to sketch out the trails in the park, But unfortunately, getting access to liquid masks in the timeline of this project wasn't really achievable, so I settled for using an asphalt terrain paste from AK Interactive to hand sketch out the paths. This didn't work quite as refinedly as I was hoping, but I was happy enough with it, and actually ended up showing up a little bit better on camera. This park has a large road to its east and newer housing developments popping up around it, but I will only include the roads and paths in this project. This is the step where a liquid mask would have actually been a lot easier, but I ended up where I just hand painted on some white glue and put some grass flocking around the painted paths one section at a time. If I had mashed, I could have just glued everything, grassed everything, and then pulled off the mask, but we had to adapt to what we had. Once I was moderately happy with the grassing efforts, I took the base outside to give it a flat black prime from a rattle can primer. For the return of the airbrush, I put a layer of flat earth tone to the whole of the base. Then I put a layer of Vallejo Dark Sea Blue to the lake basins, aiming to give it that 61-foot deep effect. All the paints I used in this project are Vallejo. If you look at the aerial images, the waters have two slightly different colors, where the smaller water features on the western side of the park are still, and the deeper portions of the park have a current, so I put a medium sea gray base for the rest of the water features. Still using the airbrush, I built up the tones of grass using some deeper greens and building up to some smaller highlights of yellows. Throughout this entire process, I did have another print of the park to help keep me on the right track. I'm not letting perfection be the enemy of progress in this project, but I am actually really happy with what I was able to whip up. I did go back in with a very thinned down sea color for the rest of the western Stillwater areas to make sure that it matched the rest of the terrain a little bit more. I went in with a new wood color to help paint up our metal trunks. I didn't feel too much of a need for these to be perfect since they'll be mostly covered up by flora in a little bit. Although, making more of these types of trees is definitely probably going to be a future project of mine. I busted out my dry brush to paint a medium stone color over all the raised rocks on the shore of the bigger lakes. I did make sure to only hit the very tops of the rocks to try and help convince the deeper, steeper slope of the former quarry. I was also very gentle to avoid dislodging rocks off of the bottom. I hand traced the roads and paths on the diorama, following the gaps in the grass as guidelines. Again, this is far from perfect, and I consider myself very much an amateur, but the fine line practice was actually very much appreciated. For the water in this project, I prepped up some of my UV resin. Using a finer tipped nose, I ever so carefully applied the resin into the smaller ponds in the park, making sure not to overflow any of them. I also used a toothpick to help the resin slide into the shorelines and the crannies due to this resin's high viscosity. For the larger ponds, I just filled them up to where some of the rocks were about 50% submerged on the top. Once settled, I hit all the resin with my UV flashlight to start curing. There weren't any bubbles when I hit it with the light, but a few unfortunately did show up. Resin has been proven to be difficult for me, but I think that overall the bubbles didn't really ruin the final project. Once cured, I took some Woodland Scenics water ripples and stippled it all over the two largest bodies of the water, making sure that the waves didn't get too big at all. As mentioned, this project is part of Boylei Hobby Time's Community Art Challenge. He makes tutorial videos that are a heavy inspiration for my channel, and one of the techniques I adore is the way he found to make duckweed in ponds. By using a needle-nosed applicator, we can dot some light green on top of resin to create a rather convincing aquatic plant. Once all the painting has been done, I then took some Woodland Scenics bushes, which at this scale make some rather convincing larger foliage. Step by step, I put tiny pieces onto the base, also finally using our metal trunks to provide some needed height variety in the forested areas. Once the park has been assembled, I can focus on a tiny bridge to connect the paths over the small strait in the park. I cut out a thin piece of polystyrene and broke it into 3 equal pieces. Then I glued the pieces together and painted them a stone gray and glued it into place, connecting the paths. For the absolute final step, I painted the frame black to its original black, and we can move on to some glamour shots. To those of you who made it to the end, thank you. This hobby provides me a much needed escape from life. Sharing these tiny, nerdy projects with you means the world to me, and if you'd like to see more of my projects, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. I'd also like to say a special thank you to Boylei. I'll make sure to link his channel and the other community members' channels below as well. Thank you for creating such an awesome channel and a welcoming environment for this hobby. If anyone who made it to this point of the video wants to see more and debatably better projects, I'd highly recommend you to head on over to their channels as soon as possible. I'll be back soon with another build, another story, and another journey. But until then, take care, and I hope you all have an excellent week. I'll see you all around.